Welcome to Unit 2, Living World Biodiversity. This is the second unit of the College Board New Course Study. Topics here, as you see, are going to be 7 different topics that will be covered in this PowerPoint. First section of Unit 2 is just an introduction to biodiversity. The most common definition of the word is just a variety of different species. The pie chart you see there just shows that the majority of things that we have identified and feel like are here on the planet are going to be in the insect category. Knowing what a species is, it's a set of individuals who can produce fertile offspring is a basic definition. It's estimated that there's somewhere between 8 and 100 million species on our planet, with only somewhere in the 2 million range actually identified. Most of those unidentified species are going to be found in rainforests, the deep oceans, and again, most are probably going to fall into the smaller categories as far as size-wise. So just that word biodiversity, with bio meaning life and diversity meaning lots of different kinds of things. We have several different levels of biodiversity. The actual word wasn't coined by him, but as far as its use and its the textbook that's used in a lot of colleges, Dr. E.O. Wilson from Alabama really had a lot to do with the use of that word. There are 4 levels of biodiversity. The first meaning genetic diversity. Genetic biodiversity meaning the variety of genes in a given species. Is there lots of variety in the gene pool for a species, or are they all very, very close? Species biodiversity, the variety of species in a given ecosystem, is typically the most used form of the word. That's the most common definition. There's also habitat diversity, the difference that you have in your ecosystems, and some textbooks will refer to it as ecosystem biodiversity. Meaning, do you have lots of variety? Do you have everything from forest to deserts to aquatic to what type of variety do you have? And then your functional biodiversity, the variety of processes, the biogeochemical cycles, what variety do you have going on in that realm? As we talk about the biodiversity of an ecosystem or of a region or whatever we might be discussing, there are ways to measure it. And when you get into the labs of this unit, you will see that there are some examples of how you'll do that. Environmental scientists, ecologists use 2 main measures to discuss biodiversity. They'll talk about species evenness and species richness. Richness simply meaning the number of species in a defined area. How many different kinds of things do you have? That's the pretty basic one. Evenness is if an area is numerically dominated by one species, or whether all species have similar abundance. So richness is just simply how many different kinds of things do you have. Not how many do you have of each thing, but just how many different things do you have. Evenness is, okay, now let's get into it. Do you have, a ton of one thing and only 2 or 3 of the others? Or do you have a more even distribution of each thing that you have? As the example show here with the mushrooms and the fungi, I guess, the community A, B, and C. As you see in A, there's several different things, so you can count your richness just by how many different kinds do you have. But when you get into evenness, you can see that some are more even than others. Community C, even though it still has a little bit of variety, you see only 3 different species, and it's dominated by one in particular. So this is a good example of species richness and evenness. Factors influencing a species or the diversity of species. One is going to be your latitude. Where on the planet are you found? The majority of our biodiversity is found closer to the equator, in the lower latitudinal lines, closer to 0. As you see the distribution of ants, you see the much greater number of species diversity as you are near the equator. Your net primary productivity is going to have the same relationship, and you're going to have a higher net primary productivity in those lower latitudinal areas. The birds, as it shows you there as well, again, where they're distributed, where you find more diversity there. Habitat diversity, and rate of disturbance, how varied your habitat is. Do you have lots of variety? Why is California our most biodiverse state? It's because they have more ecosystem diversity than practically any other. That's why Texas is very high. Alabama is high because we have so much freshwater biodiversity. And then your rate of disturbance is going to fall into that as well. It's going to have a factor into it, is how often you're being disturbed and how much you're being disturbed. If you're being completely wiped out, or are you just having enough disturbance happening on a basis where you are increasing your speciation. Time, our independent variable, is also going to have an effect. How long have you been what you have now? How long have you had for things to change? The species area curve is the graph that would be generated by showing your species and the area of their where they're distributed. If you've had calculus and you've calculated areas under curves, there's theories that go along with that species area curve and showing the relationship between the amount of area they have and your amount of biodiversity, your amount of species. And then pollution. In our stream ecology sections, and if you've done any stream ecology, the things that can live there, we throw them into different categories. And typically we have category 1 are going to be the things that can only live in clean, fresh water. And if you move to category 2, it's like, well, they need, kind of okay water, but they can tolerate a little bit more. And then you get into category 3, which are the things that can tolerate very bad water, but that's not the only thing you want to find there if you're looking for water quality, because you want to find the things that can live in good water to know that your water is still in good shape. So you're looking for the category 1 critters. As you see here, this is showing number of diatom species in a polluted versus an unpolluted stream. You may remember from the soil section talking about diatomaceous earth. These are the little things that are crushed up in that earth to help to rid off pests. As we continue into our biodiversity notes on species, we have to review a little bit of our biology and talking about what kinds of species we have and talking about generalists versus specialists. You may have also discussed this as R-selected and K-selected species, whereas R-selected are those which are mainly concerned with just numbers, reproduction. Think of roaches, where it's just as many as they can have, there's no parenting, that kind of thing going on, and they typically end up being generalists as well, and that they can survive a very wide distribution, can eat a wide variety of things. And then you get into your specialists, which are typically going to be your K-selected species, your carrying capacity, the things that are going to be like elephants. There's usually 2 of the big examples. The specialists are going to usually have a much more narrow diet, very specific habitat preferences, and when you're talking about K-selected species, you're talking about more in the parenting, that is a related topic. So here we're talking about just in niche. What is niche? Niche is your job, basically. It is your relationship in your environment. How do you fit? What part do you play? Whereas habitat's just basically your home. It's where are you found? Where do you live? Your niche is more of your job. What do you do? How do you relate to the other things? What are all those interrelationships? The example here is showing you Darwin's finches, which will come up a few more times as well, and showing how they have become specialists depending on where they have been. A specialist is going to have a much more narrow niche. They are going to have a very specific resource use. Whereas your generalist species, much broader, much more able to just get by in a lot more places. And hopefully this should show as well why when you have an invasive species that is a generalist, that they can end up taking over, is because they can survive when disturbance and other things go on. They basically outcompete the native species that may be much more specialized. Where you have resources being, or have competition over resources, you see that region of niche overlap on the graph. So a niche overlap, and you probably remember from in some of your terrestrial ecology topics and back into biology as well, and ways that species will try to avoid niche overlap, whether it be some things come out to feed in the daytime, some things come out at night, some things live at certain levels in the rainforest. You have lots of ways to try and avoid coming into contact with the things that you're still trying to get the same resources for. So that's when we talk about with niche overlap. Going a little deeper into our levels of biodiversity, remember biodiversity and ecosystem, it can include genetic, species, and habitat or ecosystem diversity, and also functional diversity is thrown in there as well. That ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems within a region. That's why it's referred to as habitat diversity. Are you all one thing, or do you have lots of variety? The species diversity, again, is the number of different species, and genetic being the variety of genes. Are you all exactly the same, or are you lots of variety, rather, in your gene pool? Now, having variety in the gene pool comes into play with disruptions. If it being physical, whether it be changes to the habitat, whether it be some disturbance, whether it be disease or something that's affecting your species. Are there enough there so that there are some who just happen to have enough difference to be able to withstand that disruption so that you're able to continue? The more genetically diverse a population is, the better it can respond to environmental stressors. This always makes me think of the potato famine, where it wasn't so much genetically there as it was that they had have so much of their diet based on one thing that when that one thing was in trouble, that it became a problem. But it's a similar example. If you have lots of variety, you have the potential for enough differences to be in existence that when that stressor comes along, you have the potential to survive. Whereas if everything is the same, and if there's one thing that's causing a problem, you're all affected the same way, you can be wiped out, whether it be a fungus, it be some sort of bacterial or viral infection, whatever we're talking about, it could be very difficult to overcome. This is also one of the reasons for keeping around our wild strains of things that we currently have chosen to modify in such a way that we use them for our food sources. When we have an issue, say a potato famine, if there are wild varieties still available, there may be genes to splice in that could save the particular strain that we are using for that food source. Population bottleneck. This bottleneck effect is something that's of great concern in today's world as we're experiencing huge numbers of extinctions and reduction in populations of species on the planet. This bottleneck effect is a reduction in the genetic diversity of a population caused by a reduction in its size. This drastic reduction can be caused by habitat loss, natural disasters, hunting, anthropogenic changes, or changes in the environment. Low genetic variation can increase the risk of disease and low fertility. This is just like a lot of the horror movies you may see, where it's always the inbred folks that become the killers or whatever, and why we have such a stigma in our society of, you don't go to weddings and that kind of thing trying to find dates. It's because you want to get further away from your genetic line as possible, because the closer you get together in your genetic makeup, the greater chance you have of the negative or bad things in your gene pool of showing up. So that low genetic variation can increase the risk of disease, low infertility, that sort of thing. And it can often result in extinction. So as you see from the diagram, it says if a population experiences a drastic decrease in size, in other words, that's going through the bottleneck, some genotypes will be lost. and the genetic composition of survivors will differ from the composition of the original group. In other words, the species may continue, but not have the variety that it had from before. So this is something right now that's going on with a lot of species, is even though we might be able to keep them around, their ability to survive long term might still be in jeopardy because of the loss of genotypes, the genetic material, the variety in their gene pool. One species that's very quickly approaching this scenario is the cheetah. The cheetah gene pool has gotten very low, so even if we do keep them around, they may have difficulty in surviving because they are all so closely related now. Ecosystems that have a larger number of species are more likely to recover from disruptions. Again, they have the ability to withstand those stressors because they have the ability to have those in their population to be different enough that there are those who may have just mutated a little bit here or there in their genes to be better suited to whatever the changes are. As you can see at the top left, very little biodiversity. That's a monoculture where we have taken and planted everything in one particular species. If something comes along that affects that species, you are going to be in trouble. At the bottom picture, showing what appears to be rainforest, of course, lots of different species, and typically there's not going to be something that comes along that affects all of them in the exact same way, except for when we are thrown in the picture and we take out pretty much everything. Loss of habitat leads to a loss of specialist species. Then you begin to lose the generalist species. That's where the joke always comes in that the roaches are going to be here long after we are, that they'll survive nuclear whatever. There's some other species of beetles that can survive more radiation even than roaches, but they're just usually the ones used as an example. This also leads to a reduced number of species that have large territorial requirements. When you have a large territorial requirement, it's very rare that big chunks of land are able to stay available in today's world. As our population continues to grow, the pressure from us and us competing for resources with the other things on this planet, we typically win. So that's another thing that's going to reduce our number of species, our biodiversity. It's back to the energy pyramids, the trophic levels, and that you can't have more gazelles running around than you have blades of grass, and you can't have more tigers than you have whatever it is that they're eating. You have to have that narrowing and less numbers at the top. And the things that require large areas are some of the ones that will disappear first. Looking back again at species richness, which refers to the number of different species. Here's one showing you with trees instead of the one we had earlier with mushrooms and so forth. And then evenness, the measure of whether a particular ecosystem is numerically dominated by one species or all are represented by similar numbers of individuals. As you can see at the picture on the right, 70% is type A, only 10% is B, 10% is C, and 10% is D. So even though there are still all four species found, you see that the majority of them are just one, so not very even. Included here are two videos, one on disappearing frogs and another on how wolves change rivers. The How Wolves Change Rivers introduced a topic, well, not the particular video, but it covers a topic that this event, as restoring wolves to the Yellowstone area, added to our body of knowledge, a term that may not even be in your current environmental science textbook that will be starting to show up more and more often, which is the cascade effect, especially of the top predators. In the past, we thought that the top predators needed to be removed because they were the only thing that was really a danger to us. Let's not try to compete with something that can eat us or that can take out what we want to eat. So we got rid of them, and we did wipe out the majority of wolves and mountain lions and bears and other things in our part of the world where we want to live. We didn't want to compete with those things. So at one time we paid money to kill the wolves and the mountain lions, Florida panthers, different genetically. They were called mountain lions when you were one side of the Mississippi, and Florida panthers when you were the Panthers when you were on the other side. And pretty much any state where you could picture there being a Southeastern Conference school is the range of where the Florida Panther used to be. And now they are down all the way to just a little bit of Florida, which is the Everglades. It's the only place they're natively found now. So what did we find? We found that it wasn't as clear-cut as we thought it would be. Just take out the top predator and we wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. But what happened was, it turns out they have an effect throughout an entire ecosystem. That whole trophic level, all levels are affected by the things at the top. With the wolves missing from Yellowstone, there were significant changes, and when they were first restored, it was amazing to see the biology that took place. The first thing when they moved in is first of all, we brought up a group down, timber wolves, and they kept them in quarantine for a while and eventually released them. When they released them, one of the first things they did was they diminished the number of coyotes in the park. They just flat took them out. Not all of them, and how they decided what the number was that they would allow to stay. It's, kind of amazing, but they took their numbers down. The other things that were kind of cool is, for the first time in decades, there were new aspen trees starting to grow in Yellowstone. And they typically grow in the riparian zone along the rivers and streams. And what had happened was the elk and other grazing critters didn't have the wolves to worry about, so they would go down just like teenagers hanging out at the local spot. If nobody's running them off, they continue to congregate there. Well, they would just hang out as long as they wanted to, and every time there was any little new trees trying to pop up around the streams, of course they ate them. When the wolves were put back, they weren't able to just hang out anymore. They were able to just go down and get a drink and leave, because the wolves figured out pretty quick, hey, it's easier to hunt the elk that are all just hanging out down by the stream. And so they would, take out one or two, and the elk went, we better not hang out here as much. We better just come down and get a drink and get out of Dodge. That cascade effect it goes even further. If the aspen trees were growing back, the elk weren't hanging out on the riverbanks as much, you had the beaver able to come back and use those trees in building dams. In other words, creating ponds and wetlands that had disappeared. And once you had wetlands there, eventually you ended up with the beavers, the frogs, all the things that would live in pond habitats being seen again in Yellowstone that had not been seen for decades. And this theory of the cascade effect of top predators has been studied a little bit more, and looking into it and seeing that, like with lions and with sharks, that when we mess with those things at the top of the food chain, top of the food web, that we end up messing with entire ecosystems. If you've not had 2011 question 1 part D on the FRQs, very important that you look through the rubric for that question, as it gives several examples of the things that College Board is looking for when they want you to give an answer regarding ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the things that are provided, and they fall into 4 categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. These are services that make it possible for ecosystems to continue to perform what they're trying to do. And as you can see in the way the chart's broken down, that in supporting the soil formation, the biodiversity, the habitat, the photosynthesis, that's supporting the ecosystem continuing. The cultural, more in the aesthetics, which is, how is something, do we consider it beautiful or pleasing? That's the aesthetics of something. The spirituality, what does your religion, what is your culture, what is your meaning of life kind of thing? How do you feel about nature? Is it right or wrong? Life existing, all those questions would fall into the spiritual side of it. Recreation, our state is very big into hunting and fishing, using our outdoors for recreation. And then it's also just the education. The educational value is what are we learning from our outdoors. The regulating, pollination, huge. How much of our food, how much of our economy do we get from things that have to be pollinated? Cleaning our water and our air, the filtration and production of oxygen. And climate regulation. Why in the world do we think that Alaska and England have different climates. It's because of that ecosystem service of the oceans redistributing the heat from the equator. And flood control, the ability for our wetlands to absorb like a sponge and take care of those floodwaters. The provisioning, this is very good in the way this chart's established to say that the provisioning is directly opposite of the cultural, is because a lot of people feel that the only valid reason for nature existing is simply to make money. And if it doesn't have the ability to make us money, then there's no need for it. So that's one way. Is it giving us food? Is it giving us medicine? Are we making money off of it in some way? And that is, part of the ecosystem services. Now, you should remember that on AP tests and FRQs, when they're asking for environmental services, they mention environmental in the question. They're typically not wanting you to give things that's going to be money related. That's going to be more an economics question. So make sure you keep that distinction. So the wealth of a nation, you see the energy and raw materials that are going in. Those raw materials are almost always coming from some sort of ecosystem service, something that's being provided. And once you get into the production and then the waste from entry, of course, you have your goods and services. You have all of this stuff mixing around with our consumption. And when your consumption outpaces your input over of materials, that's when we end up in trouble. Again, a video accompanying this from Easter Island, a good example. The Moai, the Rapa Nui, these are the statues that they put up. And this island, from studies we've shown at one time, was covered in forest. And they completely wiped out every single tree. And being 2,000 miles from pretty much anything, there was little that they could do. And that's why the people who, from the Polynesian area, they think populated there roughly 1,000 years ago, population went up to roughly 10,000 or more, and pretty much disappeared after that almost. Easter Island, I was always curious as a child where the name Easter Island came from. Well, the Europeans, when they first stumbled upon it in the 1700s, I believe, it was on Easter Day. So that was where that came from. And of course, a good one there at the bottom. Who will save the trees? It's up to you. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So back to ecosystem services, there are 4 categories again: the provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Examples in the provisioning, the provisioning is going to be the stuff typically we are making the most money off of. We're not very good at putting dollars, putting amounts to ecosystem services unless it's something we're directly making money from. We don't do a good job of the things in the other categories sometimes of what we're getting from those until we've messed it up and we have to try and figure out a way to fix it. For example, we mess up the flood control, and then we have to turn around and figure out ways to account for that, or we have to repair or replace things that got flooded, or erosion, and we can't grow crops until we restore soil, or we're not having good pollination, or we're having too many pests, or our water treatment. We have to, instead of depending on the natural or absorption and filtration of waters, we have to build water treatment plants and spend huge sums of money to be able to do the things that were being provided. So that's when we typically do a better job of figuring out, oh, that's what that was worth, instead of doing it up front so that we have a better appreciation for what we're getting. But on those provisioning services, foods, the materials for fibers, whether it be building houses or making clothes, the medicines, whether it be fuel. Biofuels are typically going to be corn or switchgrass, sugar cane, our fresh water, and then of course genetic resources for being able to have that pool of healthy genes to splice in if we need, if we've messed up the things that we're using for those things above it. Now the regulating services, climate regulation being one of the biggest, where the ocean absorbs and redistributes heat. where our wetlands absorb floodwaters or our vegetation is preventing erosion. Pest control. We have healthy populations of biodiversity. We have the ability typically to keep pests under control. We take out the bats or we take out something else, and then you have an abundance of some other pest. Or we even take out a pest. If you've remembered the activity, I'll include it with this unit as well, with Borneo, where we did the, here's 14 things, 13 things, and said, okay, how did these happen in order? And just because you want to take out a pest may not make things better, because what's going to fill that niche? You may have had something that was, just an irritating, buzzing around bug, but you've replaced it now with some stinging or, something that's going to eat up crops, moves in to fill that niche. Seed dispersal. How are your seeds getting moved around? Typically, it's the biodiversity that does that. And disease regulation. Cultural services. Again, we went through most of these. A sense of place. If you were to do the activity of drawing out what you could remember about your childhood place of growing up, most of you are going to remember where the trees were, what was grass, where the water was. You remember those things. Cognitive development. We typically do better as far as stress relief as well. We do better when we have time outside, not just always staring at a cubicle or whatever it might be. Gardening, not only for the benefit of that connectedness, not being no child left inside kind of stuff, but also you could go back to that provisioning of getting food and other things from doing the gardening. And then supporting services. These are the services necessary for the production of all the other ecosystem services. You've got to have that biodiversity. Ecosystems are dependent on biodiversity. The nutrient recycling, those biogeochemical cycles. And then the primary productivity, how much stuff is actually being produced by your ecosystem. Anthropogenic activities, that's man involved, can disrupt ecosystem services, potentially resulting in economic and ecological consequences. If that ecosystem is no longer able to function, we may have to spend money to get the same functions, whether it be absorbing floodwaters or purifying our water, providing food, whatever it might have been. So, as you see at the chart, the climate change and non-climate stressors, the CO2 rising and increasing temperatures, the adaptive capacity and adaptation strategies. As you see, biodiversity, the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, ecosystem services, and human well-being, how they are all tied together.